I'm very happy to be talking to Donnie Maclurcan today. Donnie is one of those people that when you read about what they've been up to in their lives, you kind of scratch your head and ask yourself, Jesus, what the hell have I been doing? I'll give you the highlights and you'll see what I mean. At the age of 20, Donnie entered the Guinness Book of Records by running from Perth to Sydney in 67 days. That's 3,938 kilometres. So in European terms, that'd be similar to running from Stockholm in Sweden to Gibraltar on the southernmost tip of Spain. Actually, that'd be 200 kilometres less than the distance Donnie covered because I ran out of Europe. He ran an average of 59 kilometres a day. And just to put that in context, a marathon is 42 kilometres. And this wasn't a like Forrest Gump kind of a thing where he just sort of felt like running across Australia. He did it to raise money for the Fred Hollows Foundation. This is a brilliant organisation in Australia that works to eradicate curable blindness around the world. So after that, he got himself a degree in human movement studies and went to work with over 350 athletes as an exercise psychologist, including coaching the Fijian sailing team. While he was doing that, he was working with homeless people in Sydney. He was also a telephone counsellor and a coordinator of a lobby group for Aboriginal justice. He spent 2 years co-developing a case study about the drowning of 353 asylum seekers on their way to Australia in 2002. After that, he set up Project Australia, which so far has helped 160 not-for-profit projects get off the ground and stay off the ground. He got himself a PhD in international development. He organised the Great Australian Bike Ride, which raised 250,000 Australian dollars for mental health research. He wrote 2 books about nanotechnology and global equality and sustainability, and he became a full professor at the age of 31. He went on to co-found the Post-Growth Institute, which is about creating global prosperity without economic growth. And he's currently an affiliate professor of social science at Southern Oregon University in America. And that's where he's talking to me from today. So, hello, Donnie.
Hey, John.
It's very nice to be talking to you.
Nice to talk to you too.
God, do you need to lie down after all that? I think I do, just from reading it.
It's been a full life, that's for sure.
Yeah. I had James O'Callaghan on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. James is the head of the head coach of the Irish sailing team. Did you ever come across James when you were coaching the Fijian sailing team?
I didn't, but I'm sure he's an honourable man because it's a really great sport, and I thoroughly enjoyed my time in it. And all the other head coaches that I came across were just really good people. Enjoying the outdoors, amongst other things.
Right. Okay, well, look, there's loads to cover. So can you take me through it really slowly? First of all, what's wrong with growth? Like, we've been told from right from the word go, bigger is better. What's the problem with growth?
Well, maybe it's worth starting by saying there are some good forms of growth. All the kind of community development that's happening around the world and inner work that people are doing, and the growth of forests and regenerative activities like that. That kind of growth is really good. So the growth that you and I are talking about today is economic growth.
Yeah.
And by that we're talking in particular about economic growth as measured through GDP, the instrument that was developed in the 40s by Kuznets that essentially looked at the volume of trade that was happening within nations in terms of their daily activities. But those are daily activities that occur in the formal economy. So when we talk about growth, we're talking about the economy that is registered by the government in terms of that economic activity. We're not talking about the majority of the real economy that actually includes all the caregiving and support that women in particular, and men to some degree, provide for family members, both younger and older. This is also an important part of the economy. But when we talk about economic growth and what's wrong with economic growth, we need to be clear that we're talking about a certain kind of activity that is driven through business. And the problem is probably twofold. The first is we keep growing as if there's no limit. We keep increasing our economic activity and therein the resource throughput, as it's called, which I'm going to just say for argument's sake, we'll call consumption. The amount we consume keeps growing. And underlying that is both an economic imperative in terms of increasing economic activity, but there's also a monetary imperative that sits underneath that with the way that money comes into our system as debt, which itself often fuels this increase in the growth of the economy.
So the debt makes the growth more.
That's right. I mean, anytime it's not. There's actually been an interesting study that's come out by Tim Jackson and others in the UK recently, saying that if you look at the science of it, they believe there's not actually an imperative for growth that lies within our monetary system. But in practicality, if you think about your local bank, that's a for-profit bank that's owned by a number of shareholders, they want you to consume more. They would like you to stay in debt, increase your debt, as long as you're repaying and you're not defaulting. They want that consumption of debt and therein the consumption of purchasing to increase. So there's a buy-in from the for-profit system, from all of the people who are running, especially big businesses, and for the world's wealthiest, for us to consume more and more and more. And so the second part of this is that would be okay if we lived on a planet that kept expanding. And that would be okay on a planet in which our innovation, our technological innovation, moved at a speed that the increases in our economic activity were cancelled out by the gains we were making in efficiency. But both of those two things don't exist. We have a finite planet with finite resources. Yes, we can grow more food, we can make soils more rich and ensure that they remediate carbon, and we have more trees that will remediate carbon and these sorts of things. But we can't increase the size of our planet. And there's also the law of thermodynamics that talks about entropy and that things go from very high levels to very low levels of concentration in terms of their energy. And so we know this with renewables versus non-renewable sources of energy. The fuels that we commonly use these days were created over millions and millions of years with the sun and the fossilization process. And so we take something like coal and we break it down in terms of its very compact energy, and it becomes a lot less compact. And that's not something we can quickly recycle the other way. The entropy has driven that in a certain direction. So that second part of the world is if we could innovate fast enough, if our technology was able to answer our growing consumption in a way that we weren't treading more heavily all the time on the planet, then there wouldn't be a problem with growth. But there is a problem.
How far out of whack are we with the innovation? How far is it behind?
We're a long way out of whack. Again, the work of Tim Jackson shows that we would need to innovate 16 times faster than we already are in order to decarbonize. And this is just purely looking at carbon, which is a big topical issue, obviously, but there are a whole lot of other phosphorus and all other oil and other issues that are relevant when we look at technological innovation. But just taking carbon itself in terms of CO2 emissions, you would have to innovate 16 times faster than we have been since 2001 if we wanted to maintain the average levels of European growth. Now, as you mentioned, I looked at nanotechnology with my PhD and assessed around the world all the things that were happening in that field. And this is cutting-edge science. I did not see anything that gave me any hope whatsoever that we could achieve those levels of innovation. So you asked, what's wrong with economic growth? It's that, firstly, it knows no limits. And secondly, it's not a good way for us to operate in a finite planet because it's now become uneconomic to actually grow. The impacts that economic growth now has on social dislocation, both in terms of the inequity creation process, the rich getting richer and the poor not getting poorer, that rising tide lifting all boats didn't happen. It's the rising tide lifts all yachts. And so we've seen that side of things emerge even more strongly in the last 15 to 20 years. And the other side is the social dislocation that comes with these profit-driven companies that really like to cut corners. And that causes the very problems that so many of us are working to address. But often we address those from within a system that, for example, if you run a homelessness service, for example, or a mental health service, support service, and you're getting your sponsorship from one of these big corporates as part of a major donation, as part of their corporate social responsibility, so to speak.
Yeah.
What a systems perspective would ask is how much of the mental illness or the homelessness issue is actually being driven by the very corporate that is sponsoring that system.
Right. Yeah.
So this is the outcome of growth that knows no limit, of putting profit first, of being disconnected from our hearts in the way we do economics, in a very cold science of business and efficiency that draws on aspects of Adam Smith's work and really misses his point in a lot of it, takes the pieces that people want in order to maintain the control that certain people like to have over economy and money and other people's lives, and misses the real heart of what makes an economy work, which, coming back to the very first point, is all about care for others and caring alongside others for each other.
So just going back to, like, if you stopped anyone on the street and said, I've got 10 employees, do you think it'd be good if I had 100 employees and made twice as much money? Most people would say, yeah, of course, that's what you're supposed to do in business. How come we're so indoctrinated with this thing of growth? Is it America's fault? Is it capitalism's fault? Like, how is it so, entrenched?
My gut feeling says that it was a rebound to an earlier, equally fundamentalist position at the other end of the spectrum. So back in the 1400s in Europe, there was this very anti-growth, very anti-private gain sentiment that came through in religious doctrine. The notion of making a private gain was unthinkable, and if you thought of it, it was beaten out of you with church doctrine about the impropriety of that.
Yeah.
So I think what happened was when double entry bookkeeping came in and interest on loans was something that shifted. It shifted the whole other way. So we went from one extreme to the other.
Yeah, because there was no usury back then at all, was there?
That's right.
Upon. Yeah.
It was frowned upon. And so I think really that's part of the seeds of what happened was this shift of people saying, oh, we got it all wrong, and no, we don't want to be controlled by religious doctrine, and we want to have freedom. And it's lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years, where it's almost like it's had a numbing effect on our creativity. If you think about the notion of the end of history, Francis Fukuyama's work, and that after the wall fell, that we really were at the end of the struggle of key ideas. Well, looking back, he was right, in the sense that for the last 25 years, we haven't really seen big ideas put forward in terms of the economic field. There's been a numbing that's happened. That's not to say incredible things haven't happened in the economy. They have. But they haven't happened at the behest of ideas coming forward. And I think the Occupy movement was a really good example of this.
Yeah.
We saw so much impetus for change and so little direction in terms of where to actually change to.
Right.
So,
well, that's good. That leads to my next question, which is, what's the solution? What needs to happen?
Well, I think the first thing to say about that is there's no such things as solutions if you look from a systems perspective. But I get what you're getting to, which is what's an idea for taking this forward. But I find it a really interesting thing to... I guess I want to make a comment about that before I jump into what we're working on that I think is really exciting. I think the notion of problem and solution is actually part of our challenge. And I think it's actually what has kept us numb for so long. So if you would ask that question of someone 10, 15 years ago, if you were running your podcast at that time and they were in the world of business or sustainability, my guess is that they would have put forward some kind of technological or free market response to what you're saying there.
Right.
And I think I think that's what we get lulled into, is that there's one big fix. And the thing is that even though we've got a model that we're going to discuss today that we're very excited about, it's not a utopia. It's not a Band-Aid that will be able to bridge across the entire wound here. There's 100+ years of work here that needs to be done to transform our culture into the caring, nurturing society that actually has a really good chance of sustaining itself. I think the economy is going to shift faster than that, but there is a lot of damage that's been done that's going to take time to heal if we are to get ourselves out of this mess. So to get to your question in specifics, we looked at what was happening in that debate around economics and the proposals that kept getting put forward. And we kept seeing things that were happening behind the scenes that we thought gave better answers than the kind of idealistic approaches that were getting put forward in ecological economics. And the main thing we kept seeing was that there was a misunderstanding happening around a certain business model. So when I was growing up in the early 80s, the work that I did or the organizations that I encountered in the not-for-profit sphere or non-profit sphere, or I don't know, what do you call them in Ireland? Are they non-profits? Are they not-for-profits? Are they
I think
community interest companies? Not-for-profit?
I think not-for-profit,
right. Right. And pretty much generically around the world, they use that kind of language, not-for-profit or non-profit.
Now, what's the difference between a not-for-profit and a charity?
Absolutely. That's part of what I'm going to be exploring here and how my understanding of that shifted.
Right.
So in the early 80s, my understanding of not-for-profits was charities. It was organizations that relied entirely on philanthropy or grants. They largely were volunteer-run, and that was that. The for-profit sector was business, government was the regulator, and then not-for-profits picked up the pieces that fell through the cracks and tried to plug the gaps, essentially.
Right.
That's still the common understanding of not-for-profit organizations that we've encountered all around the world. People think of them as charities. The reality, though, is really interesting, and I'm going to use the US as an example to highlight this shift that we've seen happen. So between 2001 and 2011, a really interesting thing happened in the US. And this is keeping in mind that the US is the epicenter of that crash that happened in 2008. During that 10-year period, non-profit organizations added more organizations to the economic mix than for-profit companies added businesses. In real numbers, there were about 400,000 non-profits that were added to the economy versus 350,000 for-profit businesses. Not only that, these companies, the non-profit organizations, actually paid greater wages in terms of an increase in wages, than the for-profits did. Their wages went up faster than the for-profit wages did, coming off different bases, but it's still significant in terms of that increase in what they were paying their staff. And their contribution to GDP outpaced the increase in GDP over that period itself, meaning that they were contributing more and more to the economy. How is this possible in a world in which non-profit organizations are dependent on philanthropy and the goodwill of people?
Yeah, that doesn't sound like charities at all.
No, because you would think that historically that whenever you have an economic downturn, the first businesses and organizations to go are the non-profits. Their funding dries up and they essentially wither in that process. The answer to that question lies at the heart of the economic model that we see emerging. Because the reality is that those organizations and many, many others around the world had changed the way that they were doing business over the last 20, 30 years. The reality is they got into business themselves. So these are organizations, just to step back for a second and highlight the difference between a not-for-profit organization and a for-profit. The fundamental difference, other than putting purpose first in a not-for-profit organization, the fundamental difference happens in relation to the way that profits are distributed. So if you run a company and you pay out all of your administrative and operating costs, whatever's left over at the end of your financial year is technically your profit or your surplus.
Right.
That money in a not-for-profit must go back into the organization according to its mission, in order to fulfill its mission. It can go out as philanthropy to other groups, but it generally goes back and it can pay higher salaries the next year, but it will generally go towards improving and strengthening the support, services that organization offers.
Right.
So these organizations, what they did over the last 20 to 30 years is they got into business and they started running enterprises themselves. They started selling things, renting out their property, engaging in goods and services trade, such that they started to wean themselves off the very for-profit system that was supporting them up until that point. And that means, those for-profit companies were making money, the taxation dollars were coming into government, government was able to then provide grants and support for non-profits, and the people who were making a lot of money in the for-profit companies would do their philanthropy, and that was how the not-for-profit economy worked.
Yeah.
Now the not-for-profit economy is becoming the economy. It's actually competing in that marketplace such that 47% of not-for-profit organizational income across about close to 30 countries around the world, including North America and the UK and the like, and I believe Ireland, the 47% of their income is now self-generated. And that's been increasing quite dramatically. And so,
are there any ones, like popular ones, that people would know the name of but wouldn't realize that they're not for profits?
Absolutely. I mean, maybe some of these you would realize are not for profit, like the YHA, for example, the Youth Hostels Association, that runs its hostels and makes a very good profit and puts that back into providing affordable housing, essentially short-term housing for people who are traveling around the world. We have, there's some really good ones. I think it's Camarakas in Ireland, a building company that's not for profit. My guess is that all the credit unions that are in Ireland are also not for profit as well. Right. Just over the water, you've got the co-op and all its services, which are all not for profit, both other than the bank, which is now a joint venture between it as a not for profit and other companies. But all its funeral service, its supermarkets, these are all not for profit, and it's had a few problems in the last few years that we may want to discuss. But it's an example of what can happen in a not for profit framework, and internationally, if you were looking for a big example, there is a company that's acting as close to not for profit as you could get. A very 0.003% of its income goes to some family shareholders, but the rest of it is all redistributed back into the organization and its aims, and that's Bosch, the engineering company. So we have, and there are millions of not-for-profit organizations. I mean, one that comes to mind, actually, if we're thinking about this, is Mozilla Firefox.
Really?
Yeah, it's a not-for-profit. And in fact, if you download Mozilla, they will say, thank you for downloading Mozilla. As a not-for-profit organization, we're able to innovate even faster because we're not controlled by any financial interests.
Wow.
And that's the heart of not-for-profit, is it takes out this destructive force that sits underneath the growth economy and puts purpose first. So just coming back to those trends we were saying, we're looking at the rise of not-for-profit organizations in the economy, and we're also seeing an opening of width in terms of the breadth of their services. The world's biggest not-for-profit organization is probably one of the least known. It employs over 110,000 people. It has a $450 million turnover, and its name is BRAC. It's in Bangladesh. It works in education, healthcare, finance sectors. It makes its money. 80% of BRAC's income comes from its own enterprises. It runs craft stores, bakeries, a printing press, and to think that 80% of the world's biggest not-for-profit organization that reaches over 10 million people with its services each year, to think that 80% of its income is self-generated is a really, really big shift for people in our understanding of how businesses and not-for-profit organizations operate.
Yeah, that's wild.
It's wild. And so where this takes us, John, which is so amazing, is to a thesis. What if businesses that put purpose ahead of profit continue to outperform those that don't? Because what we've been seeing is that they've been taking more market share in mutual insurance companies around the world, which are all not-for-profit, increased their market share from 23 to 27% in a 4-year period. I think it was 2008 to 2012. That's significant when you think of how big the global insurance industry is. And why would this outperforming be happening? It's for a number of reasons. If you look at a not-for-profit organization that's now taking on more of a business aspect and thinking, let's make money in order to support the good work that we're doing, they have financial tax benefits, they have the capacity to receive donations, they have the ability for discounts on all sorts of software and the like, they have the capacity to engage volunteers more readily, they have a purpose-driven motivation sitting underneath their workforce, which is particularly important for younger people who are emerging and saying that they want to work for a company that does something that matters. Yeah. They have flatter organizational structures, which are increasingly being shown to be more productive. And they don't have, the biggest one, they don't have shareholders. They don't have people who are demanding payouts, having no longer contributed in most of the stockholder companies that exist around the world. The shareholders don't add any value after a certain point. Yeah. Once a company's been floated, 30 years later, if it's done well, it's got plenty of assets to have liquidity in terms of its operations. And so shareholders are just dead weight, essentially, that you have to keep feeding with a 2 to 3% dividend every year that just gets taken out of your profit. So it's really, for us, an exciting proposition to think about not-for-profit businesses actually becoming the norm by 2050.
So if that happened, right, you know, the stock market, the international stock markets, like all that is pretty much, that runs on the for-profit model, because they're sort of, it's shareholders basically trading their shares, right? If the not-for-profit thing comes, will that sort of derail that whole thing? Will the stock market just disappear, or how will that look?
It's a great question. We're not quite sure, but it's, apart from the social stock exchanges that are emerging around the world that could prove the superseding alternative, where you're actually...
Could you explain those a little bit?
They're a little different in different countries, and so I guess I'll talk more about where I think they could go. If you imagine you had stock markets where the only investors were not-for-profit organizations, so you're actually investing, there's no private equity holders, but organizations actually have the equity in other companies, which happens already in terms of a not-for-profit owning part of another company. That, to me, could see the continuation of a stock exchange. But see, the thing, John, that I find fascinating about the share market is no one wants to call it for what it is. It's gambling. It's gambling. I mean, we have this aversion in my country of origin, in Australia, towards gambling. You know, there's lots of advertisements about the dangers of gambling, and people are aware of it as an issue, but it never extends to the stock market. That's always considered sacred and okay, but the thing that most people don't understand about the stock market, and I certainly didn't understand this, is that behind the stock market, and encouraged by the stock market and often through the stock market, is the derivatives market, which is 10 times the size of the global economy in terms of the global GDP. Right. So there is a phenomenal amount of money that is getting traded speculatively, just massive forms of gambling on the basis of what things, you know, commodities will go up and down. It's essentially, to put it crudely, it's a bunch of boys just playing around.
Yeah, and just to go back a little bit, derivatives now, just explain that in case someone's listening to it.
I'd like to see anyone explain that. But it's in essence, the word derivative itself gives a hint. It's a secondary assessment, a secondary security, as they call it, that instead of trading an actual share in a company, you're trading a speculation on what might happen to commodities or companies and the like. So it's one step further out in terms of an abstraction of what is being traded, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that if you explained it to somebody, you know, on the street or in a bar or something, they think you were nuts. Like if you said, Alan, don't sell me your bike. What I'm going to sell you instead of me selling your bike is how much your bike might be worth in 2 weeks.
Right.
How about you sell me that? they punch you in the face or something, because it's so
Absolutely.
insane.
Right.
But that's it. I mean, I'm being very crude here, but that's in essence what it is, isn't it?
Right. And so you asked what might happen to the stock market. Well, look, I think a lot of the world's biggest companies are currently very, very over-leveraged, and I think they're hiding on their books a lot of the debt that they're carrying.
What does that mean, now, over-leveraged?
Over-leveraged as in they're drawing on too much in terms of loans. They're actually borrowing way too much money based on the ratio of their assets to what their debt is.
Right.
So, and I think that they do a very good job of hiding this. I mean, I might be wrong here because I wasn't in the field of business as these things were unfolding, but I was shocked when I saw Kodak go bankrupt here in the US. Now, I grew up, with Kodak as the camera company, and I just thought, no CEO or chief financial officer could mismanage that company into the ground, but it happened. Now, I don't know the details behind it, and there's probably things that I'm missing, but it's indicative of the notion that sometimes big companies go bankrupt.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen the data, but my guess is that that's been happening more and more in the last 10 or 15 years, even as a percentage of the overall market in terms of its activity. So the point here is some companies will just collapse. I think we're definitely on our way towards a very big collapse, a very big market correction. I look at the housing bubble in the UK, the housing bubble in Australia, and I think it's not on a 12-year cycle that is typical for housing bubbles. It's on a much shorter cycle this time around. I think what's happened, and it's not my field of expertise, but what's happened with the quantitative easing that the US Federal Reserve has engaged in has set us up for a very precarious situation. We've got, obviously, the Greek debt situation that's happening this week. And we've got a US economy that can't raise interest rates for fear of slowing an economy, but needs to raise interest rates because of the issues with deflation. So it's really, we've got a scenario here where I don't think the share market as it stands could last anyway, irrespective of an alternative economy that might be emerging. It's a house of cards, essentially, that's operating like a Ponzi scheme, and we all know that those things don't last. And I think the kicker here is what the climate impacts will have on economic activity, especially oil. I mean, I do believe that we're pushing through peak oil at the moment, and I think that if you think of the way that massive companies are, and indeed our entire economy is so hooked on oil, the impact that will have on profit margins as oil prices eventually go back up and shift the other direction. I mean, the oil price spike of 2008, early 2008, was the catalyst that doesn't get talked about. When oil hit $152 a barrel, that was really the catalyst for the economic crash that came through the subprime crisis in the US.
Right.
So,
and do you think that, the battery thing that Elon Musk announced a couple of last month, I don't know if you saw the video where he was explaining how that, do you think that something like that could
I haven't looked into it in detail, but I doubt it, because it's not just, if it's not oil, it's something else. This is what Jevons paradox, the rebound effect, shows so well. You can introduce efficiencies all you like, but the associated increases in consumption that happen as a result of people saying, oh, I'm now using a more efficient car or a more efficient shower fitting, they then end up using so much more that the gains in efficiency get outpaced by those increases in consumption. So Elon Musk's battery, which from memory is hooked up to the solar installation on your roof, I believe, and then will store a lot of that energy, I suspect will just drive people feeling like they can go out and purchase a whole lot more. And this is actually a really interesting point here. It's what's called efficiency shifting. So I had a friend in Vancouver, Canada, who wrote a book about this, and he found that when he sold his car and started riding his bicycle, which you would think is great for the environment, right?
Yeah.
When he did that, he then noticed that he spent the money he saved on his car insurance and payments and things like that, he spent that on other forms of consumption which were even worse than the impacts of driving his car. So you see, you can't get out of it if we're still in this growth mentality where it's about income and consumption that isn't able to be absolutely decoupled from environmental destruction, or even relatively decoupled fast enough. So we have to get off the treadmill. We have to be taking these steps, which we are taking already, towards an economy that is fundamentally different and doesn't have this imperative to keep growing, keep consuming, constantly look out for yourself and believe in some kind of invisible hand that it's so invisible I am yet to see it.
Okay, well, let me ask you a different question then. You know the way the world's facing into an ever-growing, aging population. What will the people who've organised their retirement around investments, which is basically, you know, like the stock market, which would be, you'd think would be in for-profit companies, what will they do, or how do you think that will play out for them?
I think the future lies in investing in not-for-profit organisations through debt. So there's an interesting example, I think it was in York, in the UK, where in York, one of the superannuation companies has just now invested in social housing for younger populations, and it's using pension funds. So it's a pension fund, in fact. Sorry, I'm getting confused with the terms. In Australia, we call it superannuation. I think in the UK they call it pension. Yeah. So the pension funds, which have typically, as you mentioned, been invested in for-profit businesses, are now being invested as debt. So money that gets lent with an expected return, just like a bank would lend out money. And I believe the returns are very good, solid, not as high as the speculative economy offers, but solid. And I guess that's that assessment of how much do you need in order to survive into your old age. But that to me is the future. Why do you need to invest in companies from an equity perspective? Why not just lend not-for-profit organizations money that are doing social services and running businesses, and they just repay that loan?
Okay, good. I'm feeling better about my retirement.
Well, I think the other thing here, John, is a really exciting thing. Let's say in your retirement right now, the government takes some of your money and is investing it all around the world, right? And let's say you get a 10% return. You've been getting a 10% return on that. Or even yourself privately, you invest in the stock market and you get 10% return on average, right? Irrespective of downturns and the like, on average, you're averaging 10%. Great. What are those companies you're investing in? They're certainly not ones in your backyard, right? They're not ones within 500 yards of where you live.
Yeah, right.
Imagine if you could believe that there was a trade-off you were willing to take for a lower return on your investment. So imagine I said to you, okay, John, I can't give you 10%, I can give you 5% return, but the company that you will be lending to is actually a hospital in your town. And you lending to us will mean that we will be able to increase our service provision for people like you and your friends. All of a sudden, you look at a double dividend from that approach. So why wouldn't we want to invest more locally, knowing that that's what actually increases our well-being and provides the safety nets that we want so much through strong communities into our older age?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Where do I sign up?
Howonearth.us.
Is the gift economy part of this movement for degrowth?
Absolutely, but I see it in the broadest of sense, a little bit like I was saying at the beginning. I like to talk more about the informal economy because gift economy often looks at people who are consciously doing things as a protest towards the mainstream economy and saying, I want to live in the gift economy. I don't want to necessarily have set fees for what I do. I want to give you the opportunity to say, how much do you feel like giving me based on what I've given you and what you need? And what that misses out on is the gift economy that sits underneath our real economy, which is all that caregiving. I mean, it just comes back to this because it's so important. I haven't seen a mother yet, and I am in the US, so if anywhere this was going to happen, it would happen here. I haven't seen a mother or a father turn around to their child after 18 years of raising them and say, here's the bill. That's the real gift economy, right? So absolutely, the ethic that underlies that of putting love and care for another first absolutely sits underneath the not-for-profit economy. And more to I imagine your specific question around people who are actively saying, I want to trade more. The Mark Boyles of the world who are living moneyless and in that full barter experience. I would say absolutely that they're at the end of a spectrum that really encourages those of us who aren't down that end to shift a little in that direction and to say, what can we gain if we share more? I run processes in my community here of offers and needs markets, where in a very short period, people are able to decrease the amount of economic activity that's happening in the formal economy and that growth attitude that is associated with that, and at the same time increase the amount of service provision that they're able to provide with each other. Essentially, this is about fulfilling people's needs and developing an economy of enough.
Yeah. In, Charles Eisenstein, in his work, he talks about the new economic model as being sacred economics. And he talks about, or his book is called The More Beautiful World Our Heart Knows Is Possible. All of which kind of puts economics in a very kind of heartfelt and spiritual kind of context. Is there a spiritual dimension to your own motivation for the work that you do?
Absolutely. My journey over the last 10 years has been about connecting my head with my heart. I did a PhD, which, if you're familiar with the process, is the most, well, certainly for me, was the most destructive thing I've ever done in my life in terms of disconnecting myself from my truth. It was certainly informative and very helpful and has been part of my journey.
This is the nanotechnology thing?
Yes, but just generally the PhD process itself. It asks you to be in your head for as many years as you're able to get through this process. And so I've been in rehabilitation since then, since 2010, and in trying to reconnect myself with my heart. And for me, being in one's heart and connecting with whatever one calls that feeling of love and incredibleness that exists all around us, the magic of this world. And for me, I call it the divine masculine and the divine feminine within and outside. Just being in my heart and learning how to experience giving and receiving love more and more. And I've learned so much from an incredible teacher here in the US called Tiziana de Rovere, whose work with Adorata, which is the adoration of the mother, is so powerful and influences so much of my economic thinking and work. Because essentially, the more that I'm in my heart, the more I'm able to tap into the wisdom that sits underneath in my deepest of feelings, the wisdom that is always there for us to connect with. And that's how the not-for-profit model that we've been working on for 5 years emerged. It was about, in times of silent reflection, what came through? Or if I was out running in nature, what was I hearing and able to understand in new ways about the economy? And at some point, it just became very obvious that we could see the future shifting to not-for-profit, and that was an economy that actually would allow us to stay connected with our hearts.
Yeah, it's a lovely thing to hear. I mean, you obviously know, you really know your stuff about the economics, and for most of my life, listen, when you hear people talking about economics, it's just so cold and heartless. So right. It's so refreshing to hear you talking about economics and then almost in the same sentence talking about love. I mean, right. It's actually a little bit shocking in a nice way.
Right.
So that's lovely. Should we consume less? Is minimalism, is that an important part of the solution, do you think?
Absolutely, in the sense that the dematerialization of our economy is a critical part of all of this. But I think underlying that is that shifting, and coalescing as well, is that shifting of ethics. So in a sense, the push for minimalism, and I'll be speaking at a minimalism conference coming up in the US soon called Simple Rev, that really touches on this simplistic way of life that's becoming very trendy around the Western world. That helps feed a contemplation about what matters and what's important and an economics of enough. And the economics of enough and that exploration helps feed, in turn, the exploration of minimalism. So I think they go very much hand in hand. But this isn't about asceticism. It's not about depriving yourself. It's about having enough in a way that really, if you put purpose first and you think about caring-based economics first, then there's more than enough for all of us to go around, even in a world with 7 billion people. I really firmly believe that. And the more we relocalize our economies, the more we'll realize there's so much richness that we're just on the edge of untapping, that once harvested brings so much into our hearts and our communities that takes away that gnawing that happens inside of us of you don't have enough, you're not good enough, all these things that can be healed through this connection process.
Yeah, I think as well with when you start to declutter and get rid of the superfluous possessions that you don't really need, it has an indirect thing of, I think you sort of feel lighter as well, and that indirectly connects you into your heart in a roundabout kind of way as well. So it kind of as a feedback mechanism within itself.
Absolutely.
A group of Dutch citizens have sued their government for not protecting them from climate change, and they won. The court ordered the Dutch government to reduce emissions by 25% within 5 years, and it's the world's first climate liability suit. Do you think we're going to see more of this kind of thing? Is that part of the whole thing that we're talking about?
Yes, but I also think that there's greater opportunities to look at local renewable efforts in terms of renewable energy and actually driving the shift of investment into that field, into community-owned and run energy generation than there is in the reactiveness that comes. And this isn't to take anything away from climate change activists and movements around the world, but I like to look at these things strategically and say, how much energy would you ideally invest into something? And I think what's happened in the Netherlands is great, but I think if it might open the floodgates a little, if that's possible to. But I think that the key thing is so much energy and effort. You look at what's happening with the Trans-Pacific Partnership at the moment, and the amount of activist effort that's going into preventing something. And I think we can easily get caught up in this prevention, and spending so much energy, and lots of people get burned out in those kind of campaigns because they're not often that successful. So I guess what I'm saying here is I would see it as part of the mix, but not a massive part of the mix. And I think that where environmentalists around the world have maybe been a little unstrategic is in notions of carbon taxes and cap and trades, which essentially still play into the for-profit model. Yeah. It's still a market mechanism in a for-profit market sense. And I mean, I often think, imagine that every single person who'd put an ounce of energy or money into the environmentalist movement since the 70s, imagine that they just put that into a big land conservancy trust. There would have been enough money by now to pretty much buy up every single piece of arable land and just say, that's it. We're not expanding, and now you need to work out how you're going to deal with the fact that there's no land for you to expand into. So it's just,
It brings to mind that Swedish millionaire guy who bought up a big, I think he spent 30 million or something buying up a rainforest just to leave it, like conserve it, as you just said. Mm-hmm. Very powerful statement. Okay, a couple of quick questions about international economies. The Irish economy, which is the kind of poster child for the austerity and towing the line. There was a pivotal moment in Irish economics in around 2007 when the government made a choice to pay bondholders rather than default. And that decision launched us into austerity, which we're still kind of in now. From your perspective, do you think that was a good decision? Would we have been better off not to pay the bondholders and break from the euro?
Oh, I really don't know enough about it, John, to say much, but it does sound like it has some semblance to the US situation in terms of bailing out the banks. Yeah. And if that is the case, I would say, look, yes, it probably, as much as we didn't like it, it probably was, the alternative was probably recession of a very nasty kind. Yeah. But it is indicative of a deeper problem that if it's not used as evidence of that problem, it becomes a bigger problem. And so austerity has been the outcome, but I don't think people have been looking in the progressive camps that have opposed austerity. I don't think they've been putting forward decent alternatives. I think that that this is the challenge that lies before us, is to actually talk about how we make an economy a real caring economy that doesn't form into some notions of state socialism. And that's essentially what we're doing with our economic model, is not saying what should the economy look like, but what might the economy look like based on the trends that are actually emerging.
Yeah, I know from the Irish perspective, we kind of look fondly at Iceland, which basically did the opposite of what Ireland did. Iceland didn't pay the bondholders, jailed the bankers, and rewrote their constitution. Do you know about the Icelandic model and how it's going?
A little, but I have a strong feeling that the economies, whilst it might look appealing to have said, well, look what they did and how successful it was, I have a feeling the economies are very, very different. From my understanding, Iceland sits on a lot of natural resources in a way that Ireland doesn't. The Irish economy has had a history of challenges in terms of employment levels that I don't believe Iceland has had. And Iceland also, from my understanding, had a lot of banks that Ireland doesn't have. And so I think, I could be wrong here, but I don't think that their entire banking sector collapsed. I think they had other banks that then took up the slack, as compared to, I can't imagine what would have happened if the bondholders hadn't been paid out in terms of the economy. I can't imagine that it could have gone the same route as Iceland did, from the little that I know. Okay.
There's a definition for economics that economics is in essence the study of scarcity. Basically, it's the management of limited resources. Now, parallel to that, there's a metaphysical perspective that says whatever you focus on expands. So for as long as you're focusing on scarcity, then scarcity is going to increase. Do you think there's any validity to that?
I don't know. I think that what happens is that we fall into this false dichotomy of the opposite of scarcity being abundance, and abundance thinking can sometimes become disconnected in a way that, it's almost like The Secret, which is just the law of attraction and focusing on things, and it'll get bigger in that way.
The Secret being the book you're talking about.
The book, yeah. So, I mean, for mine, there is scarcity in our economy. That's what limits to growth is. The flip side of that is that scarcity gets set in economic models in ways that then leads to deprivation. And I think that side of scarcity, yes, can become a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of the maintenance of it at the heart of economics. But I guess what I'm saying here is that as long as you view scarcity in a healthy way, which is not about the scarcity of us not having enough and therefore we have to fight each other for it, but thinking about scarcity in terms of real limits, then I think it's a valuable principle. If you go the flip side and you think about abundance in a way that's from a healthy perspective of there's enough for us to go around and we need to share more, and in giving, in being able to receive from each other, we're actually able to give even more, then I think that's healthy. But if you look at abundance from if I just channel, universal energy, I can make as much money as I want. And if it comes from that destructive aspect of not being connected and grounded with the wisdom of what's in everyone's greatest good, then I think that's the destructive flip side of the scarcity argument.
Right. Good. So, okay, we've talked in very kind of broad terms. What can somebody who's listening to this podcast, what can they do tomorrow to sort of get on board, to sort of help this happen more than now, if you know what I mean?
The really great thing is there are so many ways that people can contribute to this. The first way that I would recommend is consider moving your money. So even if you've got 10 quid, 10 bob, in an account somewhere that's a for-profit bank, is there a not-for-profit bank that you could shift that money over to? Because we think of 10 quid. Do they use quid in Ireland?
Euro.
What do you say? 10 euros.
Euro. Yeah,
thank you. I haven't made it to Ireland yet, so I wasn't aware. So let's say 10 euros is in a bank. That's not just 10 euros. That's 10 euros, and with fractional reserve banking becomes, maybe 30, 40, 50 euros that a bank can lend out and create further debt. and then debt can be created on top of that, etc. So we have a very powerful mechanism here, and more power than we realize, to actually move our money to not-for-profit banks. The second thing is...
Sorry, just to go back now. If, say, I want to find out where a not-for-profit bank is that just a matter of doing a Google search and finding the easiest one, or are they all online, or how does it work?
But the easiest way is probably just to look for a credit union or even a mutual bank in Ireland or elsewhere in the world, and that will steer you straight away. All of those will be not-for-profit banks, as far as I'm aware.
Okay, so put your money in your local credit union, because that'll probably help your local area.
Not only will it help your local area, you'll know that all of the profits are going back into the bank rather than out being extracted to shareholder pockets.
Brilliant.
The second thing is to see if there's any ways that you can self-manage your superannuation, your pension, if there's any ways to have self-directed funds, and to put those into more ethical means. And then the third way is to really look at your consumption and say, what are the not-for-profit businesses that actually, or organizations that exist in my town, and are they selling anything? You know, do I have a local food cooperative that's actually a consumer cooperative acting as a not-for-profit? If so, can I shift more of my purchasing there?
Is there an easy way to find out if something is not-for-profit? Because...
You're right, there isn't. We're actually building a bit of a registry at the moment, because it's a tricky one. The way that you do it is you go to the About section on a website for an organization or a company, and you see what it says in terms of its ownership. If it says that they have members only and they don't have shareholders, then you can pretty much guarantee it's a not-for-profit. Okay. I don't know in Ireland about registries. In the UK, there are registries you can look up as well. But, you know, part of the best thing that people can do is just start asking these questions. Walking into a company and saying, are you not-for-profit? And they'll say, what do you mean? You say, well, do you have shareholders? Like, are there people who own this business and who can take a profit out of anything that's made in excess of all the operating costs? And even just starting that conversation is very powerful, because it starts to build the consciousness around this differentiation between not-for-profit and for-profit. And then the last thing people can do is visit howonearth.us. That's howonearth.us, which is where we have the pre-sales for our book that will be coming out later this year. And we have more information about the model and a way to sign up for our mailing list. And we would love, and we being the Post-Growth Institute at postgrowth.org, we would love to hear from people with ideas. We're always looking for volunteers, for donations, which we've just enabled in the US recently. So any chance there are for your listeners to connect with us, that would be great. And I can also be reached at Donnie, DONNIE, at postgrowth.org.
And you were talking about the looming financial crisis. What do you think, like, again, the person listening to this, if there is another big crisis coming, what can they do to sort of protect themselves or prepare for it in some way?
Invest locally, get to know your neighbours, start building community resilience in that form, grow your own food as much as possible in your towns, support community-supported agriculture, develop community land trusts to ensure that people have protections when the banks come knocking in terms of the mortgages, shift their money over to the banks that wouldn't come knocking as much in that period of downturn, and get behind the not-for-profit model. Really, really help drive this forward and say this is resilience. Resilience is having an economy that regenerates and puts money back in rather than extracting.
Brilliant. Okay, so if there was one thing you could pass on to future generations, what would it be?
In what sense? Do you mean as an idea or in terms of as an actual legacy?
Either.
Okay. I think probably good, healthy food. Because I worry about how much our food systems and the unhealthiness that has crept into those, particularly here in the US, I worry about how much of an impact that has in terms of us fulfilling our potential. I wonder how much it's dumbing us down. Sugar is such a strong drug, even in my own life. And I really would love to ensure that my grandchildren lived in a world in which food was really wholesome and that they really got that and appreciated and loved that, and it nourished them in a way that allowed them to do the work they needed to do for whatever was coming up in their lives and their time.
Okay, brilliant. That's a great answer. Well, look, Donnie, it's been brilliant talking to you. I'll include all those links that you said, how people can get in touch with you, in the show notes. Well done on all the work that you're doing. It's so inspiring, so encouraging, and it's been great talking to you, and thanks for giving me the time.
You're welcome. Thanks, John. It's been great chatting with you too, and thanks to all your listeners for tuning in.
All right. Thanks, Donnie. Bye-bye.
I've never felt this good in my entire life. Make me some spaghetti. Yeah, we are the Argyle Pimps. So buy us a drink. We're better than you thought, but not as good as we think. We are the Argyle.